All right, let's go. Number 10. Operation Market Garden. On September 17th, 1944, nearly 35,000 Allied paratroopers dropped from the sky into occupied Holland in the largest airborne operation in history. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had promised his commanders, and through them Winston Churchill, that the war in Europe would be over by Christmas. The plan was called Operation Market Garden, and it was going to end everything. What the planners expected was a rapid thrust through Holland, capturing a series of bridges before German forces could react, allowing Allied armor to pour across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. Intelligence had suggested the German forces in the region were broken, disorganized, incapable of mounting serious resistance. Senior officers who believed otherwise were told what they needed to believe. 2 SS Panzer divisions were resting in the drop zones. Reports from Dutch resistance fighters and from Allied reconnaissance photographs placed battle-hardened armored units directly in the path of the paratroopers. Those reports were dismissed. The men were dropped into the jaws of the very force designed to destroy them. The 1st British Airborne Division committed 10,005 men to the assault on Arnhem. Fewer than 2,400 came back across the Rhine. The bridge they were sent to hold, the famous bridge at Arnhem, was never taken and held. Allied casualties across the entire operation reached approximately 17,000 killed, wounded, or captured. The German front held. The war would grind on for another 8 months. General Browning, deputy commander of the Allied airborne forces, reportedly told Montgomery before the operation that they might be going a bridge too far. He was right. How many lives might have been saved if someone in authority had been willing to listen? Number 9. El Alamein. In the autumn of 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps stood just 66 miles from Alexandria, Egypt. Beyond Alexandria lay the Suez Canal, and beyond that, the entire Allied position in the Middle East. One more successful advance, and Germany would control the most strategically vital waterway on Earth. What followed over the next 3 weeks would stop them permanently. The Second Battle of El Alamein began on October 23, 1942, when General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army opened with an artillery barrage of over 1 million shells. The Allied position had been reinforced, resupplied, and reorganized. Montgomery had studied Rommel carefully. He had no intention of fighting the fluid, fast-moving battle that had made the Desert Fox famous. What made the outcome devastating for the Axis was a decision made not on the battlefield, but in Berlin. Rommel was on sick leave in Germany when the barrage began. Hitler sent him back immediately, but the battle had already turned. When the position became critical, Hitler issued a direct order forbidding any retreat, victory, or death. That order transformed a manageable tactical withdrawal into catastrophe. Axis casualties reached approximately 59,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Around 500 tanks were destroyed or captured. The Afrika Korps that Rommel had built into the most formidable desert fighting force in the world was shattered beyond recovery. 6 months later, the entire Axis position in North Africa collapsed at Tunis, and 275,000 Axis troops surrendered, the largest surrender of German forces since the beginning of the war. Rommel won every battle he fought in North Africa until the one that mattered most. The desert he had dominated for 2 years swallowed his army, and he never returned. Number 8. Monte Cassino. Between January and May 1944, Allied forces launched 4 separate assaults against a single fortified position in central Italy, a hilltop monastery that had stood since the 6th century. Each time they attacked, they were beaten back with devastating losses. The Battle of Monte Cassino became one of the most grueling and controversial engagements of the entire war, a grinding, merciless siege that consumed men and reputation in equal measure. The Gustav Line, the German defensive system anchored by Monte Cassino, and Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's masterful use of the Italian terrain, was designed to bleed the Allies dry. General Harold Alexander commanded the Allied forces pressing north. The German 1st Parachute Division held the monastery position. Some of the most experienced and ferocious soldiers in any army dug into ground that gave them every conceivable advantage. On February 15, 1944, Allied bombers dropped 1,400 tons of explosives on the ancient Benedictine Abbey. The decision was based on intelligence suggesting German forces were using the building as an observation post. That intelligence was wrong. No German troops were inside at the time of the bombing. The destruction of one of Western civilization's oldest monasteries produced rubble that the German paratroopers then used as even better cover than the original walls. Allied casualties across all 4 battles reached approximately 55,000 killed and wounded. Soldiers from New Zealand, India, Poland, Britain, the United States, and a dozen other nations died on those slopes. The Polish II Corps, fighting with particular ferocity for reasons that needed no explanation, finally raised their flag over the ruins on May 18, 1944, after the 4th and final assault broke the German line. The Allies destroyed a monument that had survived 15 centuries of European history, and it didn't even help. Was any ground, anywhere, worth that price? Number 7. Iwo Jima. On February 19, 1945, 70,000 United States Marines landed on a volcanic island 8 square miles in size, roughly the area of a mid-sized American town. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commanding the Japanese garrison, had promised Tokyo that every American who set foot on Iwo Jima would die there. He came devastatingly close to keeping that promise. Kuribayashi had abandoned the traditional Japanese doctrine of stopping an invasion at the waterline. He let the Marines land. He waited until the beach was packed with men, vehicles, and supplies, with nowhere to retreat and no cover to find. Then he opened fire from 1,500 concealed positions connected by 18 miles of underground tunnels that made conventional bombardment almost useless. The beach turned into a killing ground in minutes. By the time the battle ended, on March 26, 1945, the United States had suffered 6,921 killed and 19,217 wounded, the only battle in the entire Pacific campaign where American casualties exceeded Japanese. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders who had dug into that island, fewer than 218 were taken prisoner. The rest fought until they ceased to exist as an organized force, unit by unit, tunnel by tunnel, position by position. General Holland Smith, commanding the Marine forces, described the fighting as the most savage he had ever witnessed in 30 years of service. Admiral Chester Nimitz, in his official communique after the battle, wrote words that have echoed ever since. Among the men who fought on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. Of the 21,000 men Kuribayashi sent into those tunnels, 218 came out alive. The general himself was never found. The island that was supposed to be taken in 5 days held out for 36. Number 6. Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes in Belgium and Luxembourg, 250,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks launched the largest land battle in American military history. Most Allied commanders had concluded that Germany had nothing left. They were catastrophically wrong, and 75,000 American soldiers would pay for that assumption. The German offensive, codenamed Operation Wacht am Rhein, committed 29 divisions and virtually every armored reserve Germany had remaining on the Western Front. It was a last, desperate gamble conceived personally by Adolf Hitler over the objections of his generals. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the nominal German commander, reportedly described the plan as complete nonsense. He carried it out anyway. The plan required the capture of Allied fuel depots within days. Germany's tanks did not carry enough fuel to reach their objectives without resupply from Allied stores. They never came close. At Bastogne, a critical crossroads town, the encircled 101st Airborne Division, under General Anthony McAuliffe, held through the worst conditions of the European winter. When German commanders sent a formal demand for surrender, McAuliffe's written reply consisted of a single word: nuts. German casualties in the Ardennes offensive reached between 60,000 and 100,000 men, with losses in tanks and aircraft that Germany had no means of replacing. American casualties totaled approximately 75,000 to 80,000. The offensive failed to capture a single major fuel depot. By January 25, 1945, the bulge in the Allied line had been eliminated and the front restored. Germany threw everything it had left into the Ardennes. The Wehrmacht's armored force in the West was gone within 6 weeks, and it was never reconstituted. The road to Berlin was open, and nothing remained to close it. Number 5. Battle of Okinawa. On April 3, 1945, the United States launched the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War against an island 340 miles from the Japanese mainland. Before it was over, the Battle of Okinawa would produce a casualty toll so staggering that it did not merely end a campaign. It changed the course of the entire war and reshaped decisions that would determine the fate of millions of people who never set foot on the island. General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. commanded the American forces, 183,000 combat troops supported by the largest naval armada ever assembled in the Pacific. General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded approximately 110,000 Japanese defenders who had spent months fortifying a defensive line across the island's southern third. Unlike previous Pacific battles, the Japanese had largely abandoned the beaches and built their strength underground, in caves, tunnels, and fortified ridges. The fighting lasted 82 days and consumed both commanding generals. General Buckner was killed by Japanese artillery on June 18, 1945, the highest-ranking American officer killed in action during the entire war. General Ushijima performed ritual suicide on June 22nd as his defensive perimeter collapsed. No other battle in the Pacific claimed the lives of commanding generals on both sides. American losses reached 12,520 killed and 38,000 wounded. 36 ships were sunk and 368 damaged, primarily by kamikaze attack. Japanese military dead numbered between 77,000 and 110,000. Okinawan civilian dead reached an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 people, roughly one-third of the island's entire pre-war population, caught between two obliterating forces. The casualty projections for an invasion of Japan's home islands, calculated directly from what happened on Okinawa, ran into the millions. It was that arithmetic, cold and irreversible, that ended the war in the way that it did. The dead of Okinawa made a decision for the living that no one else had the power to make. Number 4. Battle of Berlin. In April 1945, the Soviet Union assembled the most powerful military force ever concentrated for a single operation and aimed it at one city. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev commanded 2.5 million soldiers, 6,250 tanks, and 7,500 aircraft. What followed over the next 12 days was the most ferocious and devastating urban battle in the history of warfare, a catastrophic, obliterating finale to 6 years of industrialized slaughter. Berlin's defenders, under General Helmuth Weidling, numbered approximately 300,000 men of wildly varying quality. Regular Wehrmacht troops mixed with SS divisions, Volkssturm Home Guard units of old men and boys, and Hitler Youth pressed into service with anti-tank weapons they barely knew how to operate. Adolf Hitler remained in his underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, refusing to leave the city he had declared would never surrender. Stalin ordered Zhukov and Konev to race each other to the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of Berlin and the prize he wanted most. The competition between two of the Soviet Union's most aggressive commanders drove the pace of the assault to a ferocity that cost tens of thousands of additional Soviet lives. The Reichstag was taken on April 30th, 1945, in room-to-room, floor-by-floor fighting of almost incomprehensible violence. Soviet casualties in the Battle of Berlin reached approximately 81,000 killed and 280,000 wounded, more men lost in 12 days than the United States suffered in the entire Pacific War. German military dead numbered around 92,000 to 100,000, with 480,000 taken prisoner. Civilian dead reached an estimated 22,000 to 125,000. Hitler died by his own hand on April 30th. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The city that had launched a war against the world was consumed by it. By the time the guns fell silent over Berlin, the capital of the Thousand-Year Reich had ceased to exist as a functioning city, reduced to rubble and silence in 12 relentless days. Number 3, Battle of Kursk. On July 5, 1943, Germany launched Operation Citadel against a bulge in the Soviet front line near the city of Kursk in central Russia. It was the largest tank battle in history. Nearly 6,000 armored vehicles, 4,000 aircraft, and 2 million soldiers on a front that stretched for hundreds of miles across the Russian steppe. It was also a trap, and the Germans walked straight into it. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had designed the offensive as a pincer movement that would encircle and annihilate Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, restoring German strategic initiative on the Eastern Front after the catastrophe of Stalingrad. He had approximately 780,000 men and 2,700 tanks. Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Konstantin Rokossovsky had 1.9 million Soviet soldiers, more than 5,000 tanks, and 8 defensive lines running up to 300 kilometers deep, built specifically to absorb and then destroy the German armored force. The Soviets knew the attack was coming. Intelligence from the Lucy spy network and signals interception had provided the German order of battle, the attack axes, and the date. Rather than launch a preemptive strike, Zhukov chose to let the Germans exhaust themselves against prepared defenses before unleashing a massive counteroffensive. The Germans attacked on schedule into a defensive system 3,000 miles of trenches long, designed for one purpose. On July 12th, near the village of Prokhorovka, an estimated 1,200 tanks clashed in a single day in what became the iconic engagement of the entire battle. Germany committed virtually its entire operational armored reserve to Citadel. By July 23rd, when the offensive was called off, German tank losses were irreplaceable. Soviet forces immediately launched counteroffensives across the entire Eastern Front. After Kursk, Germany never launched another major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. What does it mean to commit 2,700 tanks and the last real hope of a German victory to a salient you know your enemy is waiting for, and to lose them anyway? Number 2. Omaha Beach. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the first wave of American soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division landed on a 6-mile stretch of Norman coastline designated Omaha Beach. Within minutes of touching the waterline, entire companies had ceased to exist as fighting units. What happened in those first hours remains the most concentrated slaughter of American soldiers in a single day since the Battle of Antietam in 1862. The plan assumed that specialized armored vehicles, the D.D. Sherman tanks of the 741st and 743rd Tank Battalions, would precede the infantry ashore and suppress the German defenses before the men landed. The seas off Omaha were rougher than forecast. The 741st Tank Battalion launched its tanks 5,000 yards from shore. 27 of 29 sank immediately in water too deep and waves too high for their inflatable canvas screens to handle. The infantry landed alone, without armor, on a beach the planners had assumed would be cleared by the time they arrived. The German 352nd Infantry Division, a battle-hardened unit that had not been adequately factored into the assault planning at beach level, held the heights above Omaha with interlocking fields of fire that covered every inch of the sand. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment landed 197 men. Within 15 minutes, the company had suffered over 90% casualties. General Omar Bradley, watching from the cruiser USS Augusta offshore, considered abandoning Omaha Beach entirely and diverting his forces to Utah Beach. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, he decided to hold. Small groups of soldiers, acting without orders because their officers were dead, began moving up the bluffs by whatever route they could find. They crossed the beach not because they were ordered to, but because the alternative was to die where they stood. By nightfall, the beachhead was secured, purchased at a cost estimated between 2,000 and 4,700 American casualties on Omaha alone, with total Allied D-Day losses across all beaches reaching approximately 10,000, including more than 4,400 confirmed dead. They waded ashore into a wall of fire with nowhere to go and no armor to follow them, and they crossed the beach anyway. It stands as one of the most extraordinary acts of collective courage in the history of warfare, and the fact that it succeeded by the narrowest of margins is something military historians have never stopped trying to fully explain. Number 1. Battle of Stalingrad. On August 23, 1942, the German Luftwaffe dropped 1,000 tons of bombs on the Soviet city of Stalingrad in a single night, killing up to 40,000 civilians and turning a major industrial city into a landscape of burning rubble. It was the opening act of a battle that would last 5 months, consume more than 2 million lives, and become the bloodiest single engagement in the entire history of human warfare. Nothing before it came close. Nothing since has matched it. Adolf Hitler had become personally obsessed with Stalingrad, a city that bore Stalin's name on the Volga River, the symbolic prize that he believed would break Soviet morale. General Friedrich Paulus led the German 6th Army, approximately 300,000 men, into the city with orders to take it. General Vasily Chuikov commanded the Soviet 62nd Army on the western bank of the Volga, with orders to hold it. Chuikov's strategy was to keep his men so close to the Germans that the Luftwaffe could not bomb his positions without killing their own troops. He called it hugging the enemy to death. The fighting descended into a savage, annihilating battle for individual buildings, floors, rooms, and cellars that the Germans called Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. At the height of the fighting, the life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours. The Soviets fed men across the Volga by boat under constant bombardment, and the Germans consumed them almost as fast as they arrived. Then, on November 19, 1942, Marshal Georgy Zhukov launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement involving 1.1 million Soviet troops striking the weakly held flanks of the German position. Within 72 hours, the entire 6th Army was encircled. Paulus sent urgent requests to break out. Hitler refused, promoted him to field marshal, and told him to hold. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler was counting on that. Paulus surrendered on February 2, 1943. 91,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity, including 24 generals and the newly promoted field marshal, the first of his rank ever captured in the German army. Of those 91,000 prisoners, approximately 5,000 to 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The rest died in Soviet camps. The 6th Army, the most powerful ground force Germany had deployed on the Eastern Front, ceased to exist. Total casualties across both sides in the Stalingrad campaign reached an estimated 1.8 to 2 million human beings killed, wounded, or captured in 5 months of fighting over a single ruined city. 2 million people were consumed by one battle. The German 6th Army, the instrument of a continental empire built on the promise of German invincibility, was annihilated in the rubble of a city its commander was forbidden to leave. In the end, Stalingrad was not simply the turning point of the Second World War. It was the moment the war revealed what it had always been, a catastrophic and irreversible reckoning with the cost of what happens when the machinery of nations is turned entirely toward the destruction of human life, and no one is left with the power or the will to stop it. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.